Hello my dear children, welcome to online classes. I am Manorma Rani and today I am going to teach you class 11th English snapshot supplementary chapter 5 Mother's Day. Children, today we will study fourth part of this chapter Mother's Day written by J.B. Priestley. Before start fourth part of this chapter, children, let's look a short recap of this chapter that we have read in our previous classes. Okay children, Mother's Day by J.B. Priestley, portraying the status of a mother in a household. Mrs. Pearson is very fond of her family. She did not want any dislikable thing to happen in her household. Yet she carved for their attention and little respect. Carved means desire, means she desired for their attention and little respect. She went to her neighbor Mrs. Fitzrall, a fortune teller and magician. She proposed that they could exchange bodies, and then with Pearson's body she would teach a lesson to Pearson's family. Mrs. Pearson agreed to the idea and the two exchanged their bodies. Mrs. Pearson, who is really Mrs. Fitzrall, left for Pearson's home. She entered the home and knew what was to do to teach Pearsons a lesson so they would not bother Mrs. Pearson in future unnecessarily. Doris and Cyril entered the house. Mrs. Pearson behaved with them very badly and strictly. Mrs. Pearson was sure to make them realize that she was their mother and not a servant. They were stunned to see their mother smoking and drinking stout. The children could not baffle the situation. Baffle means totally bewildered. Doris felt that it might have been that mother got her head hit. The children began to laugh and Mrs. Pearson looked at them with contempt and asked them to behave like grown-ups. Doris then asked her mother for her such behavior and if they had done something wrong. Mother scolded Doris and she began to cry. Mrs. Pearson asked her to stop crying like a baby. Just then George Pearson enters. George Pearson, he is husband of Mrs. Annie Pearson. He notices Doris' tears and asks her, "What's this? Can't be anything to cry about." So children, now let's come to know what will happen next. So before start fourth part of this chapter, children, I have a question for you that relate you with this chapter very closely. Children, my question is, what makes a father a good father? So children, father like mother is a strong pillar in our life. A father who provides everything for his children, a father who loves his children, a father who never hurt his children, a father who provides a very safe feeling, both physical and mental, for his children is called a good father. Children, a good father always tries his best to maintain the smiling on the face of his children, and for this he can do anything. Children, now we are here talking about father. Why? Because in this part of the play there is entry of George Pearson. George Pearson is husband of Mrs. Annie Pearson and he is father of Doris and Cyril Pearson. Although George Pearson is not very good husband, but he is very good and loving father. So children, let's start fourth part of this chapter. Doris sobs. You will see Doris runs out left with a sob or two on the way. George stares after her a moment, then looks at Mrs. Pearson. George, did she say you'll see? Mrs. Pearson, yes. George, what did she mean? Mrs. Pearson, better ask her. So, as I told you children that George Pearson is very good and loving father. He loves his children very much. So, when he finds that his daughter Doris crying very badly, then he becomes very tensed and asks her why she is crying. There is nothing about crying. Now Doris replied while crying, "Oh Dad, you'll come to know yourself what is going on here." And Doris runs out from there while crying. Mr. George Pearson looks at her for a moment and then he looks at Mrs. Pearson. George asked Mrs. Pearson if she said, "I'll come to know what is going on here." At this, Mrs. Pearson replied, "Yes, you are right." Then George again asked her, "But what did she mean? What did she want to say me?" At this, Mrs. Fitzrall replied, "Oh, I don't want to talk about this topic. So it's better for you ask her what is going on here." George looks slowly again at the door and Mrs. Pearson. Then he notices the Stout that Mrs. Pearson raises for another sip. His eyes almost bulge. "George, Stout?" Mrs. Pearson, "Yes." George, amazed, "What are you drinking Stout for?" Mrs. Pearson, "Because I fancied some." George, "At this time of day?" Bulge means come out and fancied means to like the idea of having or doing something. Now George looks very slowly at the door and suddenly he looks at Mrs. Pearson who is drinking Stout. Now George becomes so surprised and shocked that his eyes almost come out. Now George asks, "Is it Stout?" At this, Mrs. Pearson replied, "Yes, it's Stout." Then George asked her, "But why are you drinking Stout at the time of the day?" At this, Mrs. Pearson replied, "Because I like it. That's why I am drinking Stout at the time of the day." Now Mrs. Pearson asked him, "I am drinking Stout this time. And what's wrong with it at this time of day?" George, bewildered, "Nothing, I suppose any, but I have never seen you do it before." Mrs. Pearson, "Well, you are seeing me now." George, with heavy distaste, "Yes, and I don't like it. It doesn't look right. I'm surprised at you." Mrs. Pearson, "Well, that ought to be a nice change for you." George, "What do you mean?" Bewildered means shocked and distaste means not liking something. Now George becomes very shocked and surprised and tells her, "Nothing but Annie, I have never seen you before to drink Stout. You never used Stout." At this, Mrs. Pearson tells him, "Yes, you are right, but I am drinking Stout now and you are watching me." George, with a lot of distaste, "Yes, but I don't like it and I think it's not right for you, and I am very surprised and shocked to see you in this manner." At this, Mrs. Pearson tells him, "Oh George, I think it should be a great change for you." At this, George asks her, "What do you mean, Annie?" Mrs. Pearson, it must be some time since you were surprised at me, George. George, I don't like surprises. I'm all for a study going on. You ought to know that by this time. By the way, I forgot to tell you this morning I wouldn't want any tea. A special snooker match night at the club tonight and a bit of supper going, so no tea. Mrs. Pearson, that's all right. There is not any. Snooker means billiard match and supper means the last meal of the day. Now Mrs. Pearson tells him, "Oh George, after a long time you are getting surprised by me." At this, George tells her, "You know, Annie, I don't like surprises. I like a disciplined routine life. And by the way, I forgot to tell you this morning that there is a special snooker match night at the club tonight. So I will have dinner there. So I wouldn't want any tea." At this, Mrs. Pearson replied, "That's all right. There is no tea ready for you." George, astonished, "You mean you didn't get any ready?" Mrs. Pearson, "Yes, and a good thing too, as it's turned out." George, aggrieved, "That's all very well, but suppose I had wanted some?" Mrs. Pearson, "My goodness, listen to the man. Annoyed because I don't get a tea ready for him that he doesn't even want. Ever tried that at club?" Now George becomes so shocked and asks her, "What do you mean? You mean you didn't make tea for me?" At this, Mrs. Pearson replied, "Yes, of course, and I think it good for you because you don't need tea." At this, George becomes very upset and angry and tells her, "That's all, Annie, but suppose if I want tea, then what would you do?" At this, Mrs. Pearson tells him in a very strange way, "Oh my goodness, listen to the man. He is annoyed because there is no tea ready for him, even he doesn't want it." Then she tells him, "Have you ever tried this manner at your club?" George, "Tried what at club?" Mrs. Pearson, "Going up to the bar and telling them you don't want a glass of beer, but you are annoyed because they haven't already poured it out. Try that on them and see what you get." George, "I don't know what you are talking about." Mrs. Pearson, "They had laughed at you even more than they do now." George, indignantly, "Laugh at me? They don't laugh at me." Indignantly means angrily. Now George asks her, "What tried at club?" At this, Mrs. Pearson tells him, "You should go to the bar and telling them you don't want a glass of beer, but you become annoyed because they haven't already poured stout out." Now she tells him, "Try this manner at your club, then you will get how they will behave with you." George, "Oh, I don't understand, Annie. What are you talking about?" Mrs. Pearson, "Yes, if you apply this manner at your club, then they had laughed at you even more than they do now." Now George becomes very angry and tells her, "Nobody laugh at me. They never laugh at me." Mrs. Pearson, "Of course they do. You ought to have found that out by this time. Anybody else would have done. You are one of their standing jokes famous. They call you Pompey Ompy Pearson because they think you are so slow and pompous." George, horrified, "Never." Mrs. Pearson, it's always beaten me why you should want to spend so much time at a place where they are always laughing at you behind your back and calling you name, leaving your wife at home night after night instead of going out with her who does not make you look a fool. Standing jokes means permanent jokes, and pompy means fatty and slow, and pompous means arrogant. Now Mrs. Pearson tells him, of course they laugh at you. You are their permanent joker because they think that you are very slow and very fatty. That's why they are calling you Pompey Pearson. They never appreciate you. They always make you fool because they think that you are very slow and very arrogant man. At this, George horrified and tells, no, never. Mrs. Pearson tells him, I could not understand why you should spend your lot of time at a place where nobody appreciates you, where always everybody laughing at you behind your back and calling you as a Pompey Pearson. You leave your wife at home alone night after night instead of going out with her who loves you, who never make you fool, who always provide everything for you, who always cares you. You leave her home alone. Why? Why you spend your so much time with those friends who are not your really friend, who always laugh at you? Now here, Mrs. Pearson, who is really Mrs. Fitzrall, wants to make him realize the importance of housewife and make him realize that he should love his wife. Cyril enters right with a glass of milk in one hand and a thick slice of a cake in the another. George, almost dazed, turned to him appealingly. George, here, Cyril, you have been with me to the club once or twice. They don't laugh at me and call me Pompey Pearson, do they? Cyril, embarrassed, hesitates angrily. Go on, tell me, do they? Cyril, embarrassed, well, yes, Dad, I am afraid they do. Dazed means state of stunned confusion, and appealingly means attractive. Now Cyril enters right. There is a glass of milk in his one hand and a thick slice of cake in his another hand. Now George, almost stunned and confused. Now he turned to Cyril and asked, Cyril, you have been with me to the club once or twice. Do they call me Pompey Pearson? Now tell me. At this, Cyril becomes very embarrassed and hesitates. Now very angrily, George asks him again, now go on, tell me. Do they laugh at me? At this, Cyril very shyly replies, yes, Dad, they laugh at you. George slowly looks from one to the other, staggered. George slowly, well, I will be damned. George exits left, slowly, almost as if somebody had hit him over the head. Cyril, after watching him go, turned indignantly to Mrs. Pearson. Cyril, now you should not have told him that, Mom. That's not fair. You have hurt his feeling. Mine too. Staggered means surprised. Now George becomes so surprised and very slowly looks from one to the other. Now George becomes so upset and stunned. He sorry for himself. George exits from there and He seems like somebody had hit him over the head. Now, after watching him go, Cyril turned very angrily to Mrs. Pearson and tells her, "Oh, Mom, you should not have told him that. It's not fair. You have not only hurt his feeling but mine too." Mrs. Pearson, sometimes it does people good to have their feeling hurt. The truth ought not to hurt anybody for long. If your father did not go to the club so often, perhaps they had stopped laughing at him. Cyril gloomily, "I doubt it." Mrs. Pearson severely, "Possibly you do, but what I doubt it. Whether your opinions what? Having what do you know? Nothing in. You spend too much time and good money at greyhound races and dirt tracks and ice show." Gloomily means in an unhappy way, and greyhound means a racing of dog, and severely means harshly. Now Mrs. Pearson tells him, sometimes it is good for people to hurt their feeling, because truth never hurt anybody for long time, and it is very necessary for your father that he should come to know that truth. And I think if your father did not go to the club so often, perhaps they had stopped laughing at him. Cyril, very unhappy way, tells her, "Oh, Mama, I doubt it." At this, Mrs. Pearson very harshly tells him, "There is no value of your opinion. There is no need of your opinion, because you know nothing about it, and you also spend your too much time, your too much money at greyhound races and dirt track and ice shows." Cyril sulkily, "Well, what if I do? I have got to enjoy myself somehow, haven't I?" Mrs. Pearson, "I wouldn't mind so much if you were really enjoying yourself, but are you? And where's it getting you?" There is a sharp, hurried knocking here off left. Cyril, "Might be for me. I'll see." Cyril hurries out left. In a moment he re-enters, closing the door behind him. Cyril sulkily means angrily. Now Cyril very angrily tells her, "Oh, Mama, I want to enjoy myself. That's why I spend my money and time at these things." At this, Mrs. Pearson tells him, "I wouldn't mind if really you were enjoying yourself, but I doubt it." Now suddenly there is a sharp, hurried knocking here off left. At this, Cyril tells her, "Might be for me. I will see." Now Cyril hurries out left. In a moment he re-enters, closing the door behind him. "Cyril, it's that silly old bag from the next door, Mrs. Fitzrall. You don't want her here, do you?" Mrs. Pearson sharply, "Certainly I do. Ask her in, and don't call her a silly old bag either. She is a very nice woman with a lot more sense than you will ever have." Cyril exits left. Mrs. Pearson finishes her stout, smacking her lips. Cyril re-enters left, ushering in Mrs. Fitzrall, who hesitates in the doorway. Come in, Mrs. Fitzrall." Smacking means tapping, and ushering means to show somebody where to go. Now Cyril tells her, "Oh, Mama, there is Mrs. Fitzrall from the next door." And Cyril addressed Mrs. Fitzrall as a silly old bag. And he again asked, "Mama, do you want her here?" At this, very sharply tells him, Oh, I do. Ask her in and never call her as a silly old bag because she is very nice woman and more sensible than you. Now Cyril exits left. Mrs. Pearson finishes her stout and tapping her lips. Cyril re-enters. Now Mrs. Fitzrall, who is really Mrs. Pearson, is very hesitates in the doorway. He is very confused and very nervous. At this, Mrs. Pearson, who is really Mrs. Fitzrall, tells her, "Oh, come in, Mrs. Fitzrall." Mrs. Fitzrall protesting nervously, "Oh no, surely." Mrs. Pearson severely, "Now, Mrs. Fitzrall, just let me manage my family in my own way, please." Mrs. Fitzrall, "Yes, but Cyril?" Cyril sulkily and glowering, "Mr. Cyril Pearson, to you, please, Mrs. Fitzrall." Cyril stalked off into the kitchen. Sulkily means angrily, and glowering means to look angrily, and stalk off means walk angrily. Now Mrs. Fitzrall, who is really Mrs. Pearson, is very nervous and very shocked. Actually, she loves her family so much. She never hurt them and she never wants to spoil the happiness of her family. She never wants to unhappiness in her family. That's why she never behave with her children badly or strictly. But when she finds that nothing is going on there well, then she becomes very nervous and shocked, and she tells Mrs. Pearson, "Oh no, please stop all these things." At this, Mrs. Pearson tells her, "Oh, Mrs. Fitzrall, please don't interfere in matter of my family. It's my family matter, so let me manage my family matter in my own way. Please don't interfere in it." At this, Mrs. Fitzrall, who is really Mrs. Pearson, tells her, "Yes, Mrs. Pearson, but nothing is going on here well. And Cyril is not looking good or happy. He is angry and very nervous." So at this time, Mrs. Fitzrall, who is really Mrs. Pearson, is very careful for her children. That's why she is very tense at this time. Now Cyril is so angry and walked very angrily into the kitchen. So children, I hope that you are enjoying this play very well, children. What will happen next? We will come to know in our next part. Okay, children? So now children, note down your homework. This exercise, this is short answer type questions. Why was George Pearson surprised when he came home? What was the answer that he got? And second question is, what did Mrs. Pearson say to her husband when he was angry with her for not making tea? And long answer type question is, what was the truth about Mr. George Pearson that hurt him the most? Okay children, we will meet in our next class. Till then, thank you. Have a good day.